Hey there, welcome back to another video. This time around, it is my review of the 1989 sequel, Ghostbusters 2. Now, Ghostbusters 2 is one of those films that admittedly is not as good as the first, but that doesn't mean that it's a bad sequel or it's a bad film, period. This film tends to be lumped in with a lot of those other tired, lazy sequels from this time, and I disagree with that wholeheartedly. I don't think this is anywhere near as lazy and tired as sequels like Jaws the Revenge. I don't think it deserves to be mentioned in the same sentence as some of those shitty sequels. If anything, this film is underrated. Yeah, it's not as irreverent or as incredible or as consistently good or funny as the first film, but there are very few films, period, that are in the first place. So the fact that it's not really on that same level isn't that big of a deal to me because I never expected it to be on that level because that's just unrealistic. And the fact that it even comes close despite being a couple steps down, is a massive accomplishment in my eyes. I still think this is a really solid, fun, enjoyable sequel. Yes, I do have some problems with it, but at the end of the day, it's still a really entertaining movie. And that's really what you want out of a Ghostbusters film or a film in general. You want to be entertained, whether it entertains your intellect or it entertains your sense of humor or some other aspect of whatever genre that you're deciding to take part in for your night's viewing. You're doing that in order to be entertained at the end of the day. And this film is a success in that regard. It really is. So Ivan Reitman returns to the director's chair, and it really is like he never left. He seems right at home working with this cast and working within this universe. And I've never felt his direction was a problem when it comes to this movie. It's one of the most consistent things about it, other than the performances by the cast. The direction, it's lively, it's dynamic. There are moments with the action and the spectacle that are actual genuine improvements over his work in the first film. The courtroom sequence is a thrilling, wild ride, and it's my favorite sequence involving the Ghostbusters using their proton packs because it's just such a really well put together and well shot sequence. Reitman also maintains a consistent tone when it comes to the direction. He has everything flowing well, just like the river of slime. And he just was a guy who you could tell loved working with this cast and loved doing Ghostbusters movies. There wasn't really a moment with the direction where it seemed like, oh, his heart wasn't in it. No, you could really feel that love and that genuine passion and enthusiasm for Ghostbusters throughout the entire film when it comes to the way that things were shot. This film was handled lovingly and with care by Ivan Reitman, and that's a huge reason why this film, in my opinion, is as good as it is. Because if you had a different director, it might have still worked and might have actually been potentially even better, but the risk was just too great to take, if you ask me. So it made more sense to bring back the father of the Ghostbusters, bring him back to direct and work his magic. And this is honestly probably one of his last great films when it comes to Reitman's career. And he did some stuff afterwards, but not really on the same level as Ghostbusters 2. At least for me personally. I mean, he did a film. I think he directed Father's Day with Billy Crystal and Robin Williams, and that was disappointing. And he's done a few other films, but Ghostbusters 2, this was in a lot of ways the last that we saw of peak Ivan Reitman as a comedic filmmaker. And it was a good way for him to send off his peak and really create another impressive, incredible bit of directing to add to his resume. And it was a really ambitious film in a lot of ways when it comes to a lot of the different shots that had to be put together, a lot of the different visual effects shots, and have them seamlessly integrated into the film. So it's a very special effects heavy film, even compared to the first movie, which wasn't something that Ivan really had a lot of experience with other than the first film. So that was another thing about his direction that I thought was really noteworthy, is that he handled all of those elements so well and with the same laser focus that he showcased in the first film when it comes to his work in that movie. The script by Harold Ramis and Dan Aykroyd, it could have been a lot worse because Dan Aykroyd and Harold Ramis, or it was just Dan, there was this absolutely shitty, god awful script that they were working on called The Return of the Ghostbusters, and it involved fucking fairies. I'm not making this shit up. It involved fairies in Scotland. So before anyone remarks how lame this sequel is and how it's one of the worst sequels, you have no fucking idea, because this film could have been a million times worse. Like, if they did that movie, then I would be with everybody. I really would. Dana Barrett in Scotland and fucking fairies. Yeah, I would have been like, yeah, okay. People were dead on about Ghostbusters 2. I mean, fairies, what the hell were they thinking? I would think it would be one of like the worst sequels out there, because the Ghostbusters in that script, they barely do anything, and you've got fucking fairies. I mean, I don't really necessarily have a lot of issues with fairies in general, but just not in this franchise and not in the sequel to Ghostbusters. And also, what the fuck do fairies have to do with ghosts to begin with? So, this isn't Legend 2. This is Ghostbusters 2. So yeah, it could have been so much worse. Now, it's definitely a blessing that Dan Aykroyd and Harold Ramis did not decide to go forward with that script. But the script that we ultimately did get is still not really as good as it could have been. For one, it does suffer from a lot of the same flaws and faults as a ton of other sequels from the time. It does lazily copy a lot of the same elements that made the first film so successful. I get it, it's understandable, but at the same time, I think they could have done a little bit more to do something different instead of just having the Ghostbusters back to square one and teaming up again, having another montage of them busting ghosts, and even having another giant figure in the finale. Instead of it being the Stay Puft Marshmallow Man, it's the Statue of Liberty. But all of that being said, I still don't feel that this film is just the same movie as the first film. I've seen that criticism a lot, but I don't think it's entirely fair. Yes, there are elements that are very similar. The Ghostbusters have a scene where they go talk to the mayor and they try to convince him, but this time around it doesn't work. That's the only difference that they really did here with the screenplay. Or you have another guy who's a foil for the Ghostbusters, but instead of it being the EPA agent in William Averton's character, it's the mayor's aide. So there's a lot of similarities in that regard. But there are some differences as well that I think are overlooked. For instance, yeah, the fact that they're split off and they're doing their own thing in the beginning is not necessarily new because they kind of were doing the same thing at the start of the first film. At least at least the things that they are doing are new, are different, are fresh. Yeah, Ray and Winston working birthday parties dressed as Ghostbusters, but kids don't want anything to do with Ghostbusters. They think they're lame. They want He-Man. You've got Venkman hosting some cable show called The World of the Psychic. I don't know why they didn't have him hosting a game show. It was just a huge missed opportunity. Maybe it's just one of those things where it just made too much sense, so they decided to go a different route, or it was too predictable. But in this instance, the fact that it was predictable was a positive because it was predictable because it was a great idea. I mean, it was just serendipity. It would have worked so well because it ties into a line that Dana said in the first film. Because she didn't really see him as a scientist. She saw him more as a game show host. But I still like the World of the Psychic bit. I think I can still see Venkman doing that. And then you've got Egon doing his thing, doing weird, twisted experiments on human emotion, trapping a married couple in a room for hours just to see what happens with their emotions, and then on the other side in another room working with this kid and seeing how her emotions spike or what happens when she gets a puppy. So you could totally believe that this is where all these characters would be 5 years later after the first film. So I like the setup of Ghostbusters 2. I like the fact that you see these characters in different situations, and I felt that there was enough twists and turns and differences with their character arcs in the beginning of the film that it didn't feel like they were just doing the same thing. Also, I think Vigo the Carpathian is a great creation, a really fun, cool idea for a villain. It's this centuries old magician, sorcerer who didn't really die. It took the townspeople drawing and quartering him and just cutting him to pieces in order for him to finally kick the bucket. And even then, he had a plan in place, which was brilliant. He trapped his soul inside a painting and waited for the right time when he could live again and rule the world. And it's up for the Ghostbusters to stop him. And he gets his energy from this slime, which is tapping into the emotions of humans. It taps into the experiments that Egon was doing at the beginning of the film. I like that there's a connection there. And I just think that's a really gonzo, wild concept. It's just genius. It's really smart. It's a really clever concept with the slime. And I like how the Ghostbusters positively charge it with Jackie Wilson songs and find a way to use the slime to their advantage. It does deliver when it comes to the new tech that you want from a sequel, where you have your characters are very reliant upon tech to get the job done. So it makes a lot of sense that they would have new tech. They would have new uh, PKA meters, the Geiger meter. They would have the slime blowers. So that's the kind of stuff that you look for in a sequel, to see things that you haven't seen before. And while, yes, having the Statue of Liberty at the end is similar to the Stay Puft Marshmallow Man, it also is different enough because instead of the giant figure being the source of our devastation, it's the source of our salvation. And it's a equally epic, grand spectacle of a moment visually. And it makes sense that you would have something that would lead to Dana and Venkman falling out, because Venkman's just this kind of character where you could kind of see him being this guy who just couldn't really stay tied down in a relationship. But then that led to the two of them reconciling and sharing some sweet, tender moments with one another, and doing so in a way you never really got to see in the first film because there was a lot of animosity or just kind of early sparks. Like nothing really ignited to a pure flame yet, because before Venkman could really get things going and put the moves on her, she was possessed by Zool. So that you just didn't really have that moment yet on screen, and you see those moments and they're really charming. And there were some really sweet moments with Venkman and the baby. And I think the character of Janosch is a great addition to the film as well. He's a foil to the Ghostbusters, but he's doing it in a way that doesn't seem like it's just Walter Peck 2.0, like the mayor's aide Hardemeyer. And then you have other stuff, like little things like Lewis and his character doing some different stuff. Like he's the Ghostbusters lawyer in the beginning. Uh, you have a relationship that forms between him and Annie Potts' character, Janine, which is also really sweet and lovely, and they have some good chemistry and a good connection with one another. And then you have some aspects of the climax that I like the shell of slime weakening because the New Yorkers are singing a song, they're singing Auld Lang Syne. I like that. The Statue of Liberty is epic. It's a really grand moment of spectacle. And when the slime starts flowing it through the streets and you see all the different kind of ghosts, like they really did up the ante. I mean, you got the Titanic that arrives late. You've got these different kinds of ghosts. But when you get to Vigo facing off against the Ghostbusters, it's a letdown. That's one of the other aspects of the screenplay that, in my opinion, falls pretty flat. He gets out of the painting. He deflects their proton blasts. He then shoots some energy beam out of his mouth at the Ghostbusters. Seems like they're done for. And then the shell and his powers weaken because of the New Yorkers singing outside. And then the Ghostbusters just shoot him a couple more times with the proton packs and slime. His head flies back into the painting. Ray gets possessed for what feels like 30 seconds. And then they blast it again, and then the painting explodes, and that's it. Like, it just felt like it was nowhere near as epic as it was building up to be. So that's another aspect of the script that is not really as good as it could be as well. And another thing is, it is definitely a tamer script when it comes to a lot of the more horror elements. What's funny is when I was a kid, I thought this was scarier than the first film, with the severed heads in the subway and Janusz and his eyes and some of these other things. But now as an adult, when I rewatch those scenes, I'm like, why did I ever find them to be scary? Maybe the severed heads, but I've seen scarier shit in Poltergeist in an Indiana Jones movie. And the stuff with Janusz's eyes, like, that's just lame. Or the thing with the baby. I used to be scared of Janusz as a ghost with the red eyes, dressed as a maid, when he stole the baby with the baby carriage. I don't understand why that used to scare me so much. Because seeing that as an adult, I'm just laughing my ass off. It's fucking laughable. Especially in comparison to some of the elements that were at play in the previous film in terms of the horror scary stuff, or even stuff like in this film, like the Scoleri brothers. Like the design of those ghosts was creepy and definitely inspired in some ways by the real Ghostbusters, but it still had a very sinister look to it, and that just is completely absent with Janusz as a maid. Um, and it also is evident with the comedy. You could tell that they toned things down because they wanted to appeal to the same demographic that loved the real Ghostbusters. And I get it, but at the same time, you just lost some of the luster that made the first film so great. Losing that edge is a big part of why this film isn't as funny as the first. There are some moments where I'm still laughing and I'm smirking and I'm chuckling, but it just doesn't have the same edge and irreverence because it just feels like the cast and the guys just aren't able to have the same lack of boundaries. They are limited more, and that definitely does show. But all of that being said, I still think this is a pretty solid script, especially one that had to be rewritten multiple times, kind of last minute because the original script was so god awful. So what we have here is still solid. It's still good. It's still got a lot of crowd pleasing, fun moments. It's got a lot of creativity, and it still really gets the Ghostbusters. It gets why these characters work. It gets why these instances of the supernatural combined with these regular guys is something that's so endearing. It definitely does get that. It understands the relationships with these characters and the relationship that the characters have with the audience, and that goes a long way. Now, speaking of characters, of course you can't talk about Ghostbusters 2 without talking about the cast. I mean, it's one of those sequels where pretty much every single member of the original cast returns. The only yeah, actually every single member of the original cast does return. I can't think of anyone that doesn't. Like how often does that happen? Especially with this kind of film. You've got Bill Murray, Dan Aykroyd, Harold Ramis, Ernie Hudson. They all come back as the Ghostbusters. You've got Sigourney Weaver who returns as Dana Barrett. You've got Rick Moranis who comes back as Louis Tully. You've got Annie Potts as Janine. You've got newcomers like Peter MacNicol who almost steals the show as Janusz. Kurt Fuller, he's the new foil replacement for Dickless, but it just doesn't really seem like it's the same. It really does feel like dickless sloppy seconds. Like, we know what you're trying to do here. Yeah, the guy's an asshole, but he's not really an asshole on the same level of entertainment as William Averton. David Margulies as the mayor. You've got Janet Margolin who plays the prosecutor in the beginning. You've got William and Hank Duschendorf as the baby Oscar in few scenes. You've got Willem von Homburg as Vigo, who's voiced by Max von Sydow, which is something I didn't know for years. And I've been a fan of this film for decades. I'd seen this film over and over and over again, hundreds of times, just like the first movie, and I never even knew that Max von Sydow was the voice of Vigo until I think like a year or two ago. So yeah, great cast. I mean, Bill Murray, Dan Aykroyd, Harold Ramis, and Ernie Hudson, they still have that nuclear chemistry that they had in the first film. The reason why this cast decided to sign on and do another one is simply because they met up together for lunch. Seriously. They met up together, they met with Ivan for lunch, and then they started talking about how much fun they had making Ghostbusters. And then they decided, let's do another one. That's really where it came from. And that's a big reason why I don't understand why there are people out there that say that this seems like a heartless sequel, or this seems like a sequel where they only did it for the money. No, they did it because they wanted to have the same amount of fun that they had making the first movie. That's the really that's really the main reason why this cast decided to do this film, is because they thought it would be fun. And you can see that. You can see interviews with Bill. You can see other outtakes with Bill and the cast that show that despite what Bill likes to say now, after all these years, talking about how it wasn't fun or blah, 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 you don't see that at all on the screen or when it comes to the various different behind the scenes photos and footage that you might come across when it comes to Ghostbusters 2. It doesn't seem like he was trudging his way through the production. It didn't seem like he was miserable, like he seems to say that he was in interviews today or in the past few years or so. It's not evident at all. I mean, there's one scene that just encapsulates why these characters work so well to me. And it's the toaster scene. It's something so ridiculous and stupid, but they are so committed to it and they love working together so much that they make it into a scene that's just pure movie magic. The ending of that sequence is one of my favorite moments with the Ghostbusters, where Ray just runs up and grabs Venkman and picks him up, yelling out of pure joy. That is a moment that really does show why a lot of people love these characters, because there's a certain dynamic with these characters that you just cannot recreate with other cast members or other personalities. And it's something that's just so real and so genuine and just so infectious in terms of the enthusiasm and just love that these actors have for one another. You can tell that they are friends. And not just work friends. Like, they are legitimate, really close friends. And that really does play out on the screen in every scene that they're in. A big reason why this film is still really good, if not great at times, is because of the cast and their already inherent and existing dynamics with one another. Then you have other elements of the film that are worthy of highlighting. The editing by Don Camburn and Sheldon Kahn, I thought it was pretty tight. It was pretty solid, especially in the sequences that were trying to be a little bit more fast-paced or a little bit more frantic. I felt the editor did a really fine job in those sequences. The music by Randy Edelman, I love. It's different than Elmer Bernstein's score, but it's still really effective in its own right. And it's a really awesome sight to see or really, it's an awesome thing to hear that the score is finally officially available, because I've always liked this score. I thought it fit the film well. It was quirky, uh, and fun, just like the score from the first movie, but in a different way altogether. Speaking of music, this film also features a pretty good soundtrack as well. I don't really care for the Run DMC rap version of Ghostbusters. I wish they just played Ray Parker Jr.'s song again. But I do like Glenn Frey's Flip City, Oingo Boingo's Flesh and Blood, even though it only plays a little bit in the film. And I genuinely enjoy Bobby Brown's On Her Own. And there's some other songs from the soundtrack I don't mind, but the thing is, the soundtrack doesn't really have a song like Saving the Day that's an instant classic to me, or a song on par with Ray Parker Jr.'s Juggernaut that is the Ghostbusters song. So you don't really have something that's really on that same level, but it's still a good soundtrack, and I would recommend it if you're a fan of original motion picture soundtracks from this era. The cinematography by Michael Chapman, it's okay. This doesn't have the same gritty look to it as the first film. The first film almost had some sequences that looked like it was right at home in a grindhouse film. This is very clinical, very clean, very smooth, and that really is something that pans out well when it comes to a visual effects sequence. But when it comes to some of the other scenes, they look a little flat visually. They kind of remind you of a sitcom from this era or a cable movie. So that's not really the kind of vibe that you want from a big tentpole, big ticket blockbuster like this film was really marketed and was intending to be. But it could have been a lot worse. And then you've got the visual effects. I want to mention those because ILM outdid themselves here. Um, Instead of it being Richard Edlund and his company Boss Films, Industrial Light and Magic, they're the company that was responsible for the effects in Ghostbusters 2. And in 1989, they had a huge slate on their hands. And Ghostbusters 2 was one of the most extensive projects that they were working on that year. This film needed over, I think it was over 120 different effect shots, and they all had to do it under a severe time crunch. So I'm going to give ILM and everyone who worked on this film with the visual effects a big giant hand. And they deserve all the kudos and then some. To do what they did here under such a massive time crunch in order for the film to be out in theaters for the release date is nothing short of jaw-dropping and impressive. So, yeah, they deserve a ton of credit. And these are great-looking effects. And they had to cut out, there were some effects that they cut out, like a demon frog. They had to cut out of the film because just didn't have the time. Didn't have the time to finish it and make it look the way that they wanted it to. So maybe that's why the climax was a little lackluster. Maybe that's why it seemed like it was rushed, is because it might have been. That being said, you could have had a couple other ghosts or something. Something come out of the paint, another painting, or come out of the painting. Vigo brings something in the museum to life for the Ghostbusters to fight. You could have done something at least. But maybe the reason why is because ILM was like, we can't do anything else, man. Our plate is too full. And you don't have the budget to do anything else either. You've already spent it all. But yeah, I'm always a guy who admires and appreciates the work of visual effects artists and makeup guys, and I've always felt that this film had some of the best visual effects from this particular year, if not of the decade. I mean, there's just this film has some really incredible, just amazing visual effects. I mean, the way that they set up the Statue of Liberty, I still think is a really uh, quite spectacular uh, visual effect. And it's also a film that goes by at a pretty quick pace. It's like 108 minutes. It doesn't really feel like it's too long. It doesn't feel like there's moments where it's dragging too much. And yeah, I still really enjoy Ghostbusters 2. I think it's a terrific, fun sequel, despite it having flaws. For the most part, it succeeds more often than it fails. And that's exactly what you would look for out of a sequel. So it's always a movie that I will defend. I will stand up for, because I don't think it's as poor as people make it out to be. And there are things that I wish could have been done a little bit better, but considering what happens next with this franchise, with the 2016 reboots, this film is a masterpiece in every shape of the word, and whatever flaws that it has pale in comparison to what comes next. So, yeah, Ghostbusters 2, it's not as consistently brilliant as the first, but it's still not a bad film at all. It's still really good and really fun to watch. So anyway, thank you for watching my review of Ghostbusters 2, and as always, I'll see you later. See ya.